Alexander the Great of ancient Greece, who lived about 330 BC, and the mysterious UFOs following his army. Fact or fiction? Well, we have ancient Greek historians' accounts of Alexander the Great going into the Taklamakan desert of China. And Taklamakan meaning you go in but you don't come out. And he lost over a third of his warriors there. He lost 10,000 of them there. But he insisted on going because he was to meet with extraterrestrial Atlanteans from Hyperborea who were to give him a secret, mysterious, high technology weapon. It looked like, they say, the lightning rod of Zeus. Some say that it was also some type of a technology that was able to give him the ability to enter into interdimensional spaces. Now, more than 2,000 years ago, Alexander the Great created one of the largest empires in history. His father, as we know, Philip II, was the king of Macedonia who united all the kingdoms of Greece into one country, because every city was a kingdom. He united Greece, and then Alexander the Great conquered all the known world up to India. So, more than 2,000 years ago, Alexander the Great created one of the largest empires in history, stretching from Greece to the northwestern India, earning a reputation as an invincible military man, one of the greatest and most successful military leaders in history. Was the army of Alexander the Great pursued by UFOs? Well, as we said before, ancient writings by his historians, he carried historians with him, scientists, mathematicians. They were recording everything that he was doing. And we said he went into the Taklamakan desert to meet a UFO. An Atlantean was to give him a very secret advanced weapon. We also know that his conquest of the island of Tyre had to do with UFOs, a mothership with some fleet of UFOs coming out of the mothership, and using laser beams destroyed the walls of Tyre, and Alexander the Great and his army were able to conquer Tyre. There are many stories about the exploits of the Macedonian king and his army, but some of the strangest ones are about his army it was pursued by UFOs, given that distant antiquity only birds like eagles or vultures could be the largest flying objects in the sky. This story looks very curious. The very first report that something unusual was pursuing the army of Alexander the Great from the sky dates back to 329 BC. At that time, his army was advancing on the enemy city in Central Asia, and it was a huge procession of people, horses, and elephants. According to the story, when they tried to cross the Jaksart River, now known as the Sir Darya, passing through Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Kazakhstan, at night they were attacked from the sky by two large silver shields spewing fire. These shields so frightened the soldiers and animals that they postponed the crossing until the next day. It's difficult to say whether this is true or a story made up, a legend, since the first known reminder of this appeared only in the 20th century in a book in the history of the Macedonia from Alexander Donsky from Yugoslavia, historian. And there it was noticed by the then popular American ufologist Frank Edwards, who later published it in his book Stranger Than Science, from where it scattered into many other books. Edwards was sure the story was true. He said Alexander the Great mentioned two strange objects that repeatedly swooped down on his army until the war elephants, men and horses, panicked and refused to cross the river where the incident took place. What did it look like? The historian describes them as large, shining, silvery shields, spewing fire around the edges. These were the entities that came from heaven and then returned back to heaven. As for skepticism, another historian, Spencer McDaniel, wrote about this in this way. He said, Edwards cites no source for any of these claims, and it's unlikely that he ever had any. His claim that Alexander's army literally saw great shining silvery shields in the sky does not even remotely resemble not a single statement in any surviving ancient source about Alexander the Great. This claim is probably completely made up. The ancient sources about Alexander's campaigns do mention some kind of silver shields, but not in the context of anything that could reasonably be interpreted as having anything to do with UFOs. As for another case where UFOs were chasing Alexander's army, the Italian ufologist Alberto Ferraglio somewhere discovered the following story, supposedly taking place in 332 BC, at the height of Alexander the Great's siege of Tyre, during his campaign against the Persians. The fortress did not give up. Its walls were 50 feet high and so solidly built that no siege engine could damage it. The Tyrians destroyed the greatest technicians and builders of war machines of that time, and they intercepted in the air the incendiary arrows and projectiles that catapults thrown into the city. One day, these flying shields, as they were called, suddenly appeared over the Macedonian camp, Alexander the Great's camp, flying in a triangular formation, led by an extremely large shield, a UFO craft. The rest were almost half its size. They were 5 in total. An unknown chronicler describes them as slowly circling over Tyre, while thousands of warriors on both sides stood and watched them in amazement. Suddenly, a flash of lightning burst from the largest shield, which hit the walls, and they collapsed. More flashes followed, and the walls and tires collapsed as if they had been built of mud, leaving the way open for the besiegers, that's Alexander the Great and his army, who avalanched through the gaps in the walls. The flying shields hovered over the city until it was completely taken by storm. Then they very quickly disappeared into the air, soon disappearing into the blue sky. So the first story tells how a UFO attacked the Alexander's army, preventing them from crossing the river, but the shields from the second story, on the contrary, helped his army win. Is there any particular logic here? Critics do not consider this case particularly reliable. The same Spencer McDaniel wrote about him in this way. The only ancient text that even remotely resembles the Ferraglio describes it is contained in the history of Alexander the Great by Quintus Curtius Rufus. Curtius writes, indeed, the Tyrians heated bronze shields with great amounts of fire, which being filled with hot sand and boiling mud, they were suddenly thrown off the city walls, and no plague was feared more than this one, for when the red-hot sand penetrated between the armor and the body, the man could not shake it out by any force, and there everything he touched burned. And the soldiers, having thrown down their weapons and torn into pieces everything that could protect them, stood vulnerable to injury, unable to retaliate. I believe this passage is technically referring to flying shields during the siege of Tyre, but the shields are real, literal shields made of bronze, and they only fly because the Tyrians throw them at Alexander's soldiers on the walls of the city. This passage is clearly talking about defensive siege warfare and not UFOs in any sense. Ferraglio may have read Edward's statement that Alexander saw large shining argent shields. He may have gone in search of the source and may have found some version of the passage from Curtius describing the Tyrians throwing down their shields during the siege of Tyre. And then perhaps he severely misinterpreted this passage to make it about UFOs. I suspect, however, that it is more likely that Ferraglio never read any of Curtius's works, and he simply made up the whole story of Alexander seeing flying shields during the siege of Tyre solely as an embellishment to Edward's earlier history, and his description just bore a vague resemblance to something Curtius was actually describing. And this is on Infinity Explorers by Anne Shrivastava. Please leave your comments, and thank you for your support. My Patreon account. The daily posts are 5 videos daily, and they are totally different from what I have on my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for your support. and that you find all my content so interesting. You'll find the Patreon account details in the description box below.